No Country for Old Men starts out like your typical Western, with establishing shots of the desert environment. We see tumbleweeds, a singular old-fashioned windmill, and straight, narrow roads seeming to lead to nowhere. However, as the film progresses, it becomes clear that despite its pastoral imagery, No Country for Old Men is nowhere near a typical Western, but rather perhaps a dying breath of the iconic genre that so dominated the golden age of Hollywood and its imitators. While we see these images, we also hear the narration of a solemn, tired older man named Bell. He talks about looking back at the old-time sheriffs and how some of them never even had to carry a gun. He wonders how on earth they would have dealt with criminals these days, like the boy he had arrested a while back, who murdered a 14-year-old girl for no apparent reason. There was no motive to that killing, not even passion or love. The boy had always wanted to kill someone and said he would do it all over again if he could. Here, this immediately turns the classic Western sheriff archetype on its head. There's no badass monologue about being an outlaw, riding on a horse, or protecting a small town with little else but a pistol and a lasso. No sense of stoic, cold masculinity. Instead, we get a vulnerable frailty and a longing for a simpler, more comprehensible past. In his journal article, The Psychological Appeal of the Hollywood Western, Frederick Elkin states that there are two basic characteristics to all Westerns: action and simplicity. The standard Western story is a continual series of chases, daring rescues, galloping horses, gun battles, and fistfights, and there are few complications, no changes of clothing, no variation in settings, no intrusion of traffic, mothers, schools, or economic hardship. No complex characters, no mistaking the good men from the bad, and no serious doubt about the story's outcome. No Country for Old Men is classified as neo-Western, a subgenre defined by its modernization of the traditional Western genre, the latter of which had fallen out of audience favor by the 1980s, the decade of blockbusters and franchises. As the myth, the lawless yet somehow just world of the Wild West, so deeply rooted in Americana, faded away from the conscience of most moviegoers, the once triumphant Western gave way to action, horror, and science fiction films like Star Wars, RoboCop, and The Evil Dead. For a while, it seemed as if the era of the Western had died, which, in a way, it did. Yes, there was Unforgiven in 1992 and Dances with Horses in 1990, but nothing came close to the prowess of Sergio Leone's spaghetti western flicks of the 60s, or Howard Hawks' Red River and Rio Bravo of the 40s and 50s, respectively. If anything, neo-westerns try not to replicate such films from the glory days, but rather twist their narratives. In No Country for Old Men, we can see this twist in three primary ways. They're the characters, the aesthetic choices, and the plot structure. Each of the main characters in the film represents a different Wild West trope, whether it be the sheriff, the anti-hero cowboy, the outlaw, the bounty hunter, or the damsel in distress. In this video, I'm going to focus on the former three, starting with Llewellyn Moss, the main protagonist of the story, embodying the anti-hero cowboy archetype. For the most part, Moss fits into the generally likable yet somewhat morally ambiguous protagonist mold well. He's unpretentious, though clearly looking out for himself first. However, when he stumbles upon a drug deal gone wrong one fateful afternoon, he makes a fatal mistake, an act of nobility. Right before he steals a briefcase of money left nearby, he encounters a dying man in a jeep who feebly begs for water and is apparently scared of the wolves in the surrounding area. Moss dismisses these concerns callously and leaves him to bleed out. So, from what we've seen so far, there's not much noble about him, unlike the John Waynes of the years past who seem to have some sort of purpose for existing in the wild world around them, even if that purpose was killing Native Americans, participating in duels, and avenging their family honor, etc. But we do see this moment of kindness here after he goes home with the money and finds himself unable to fall asleep. He fills up a jug with water and he goes back to the crime scene to seemingly redeem himself, but the man is already dead. Suddenly, everything shifts when he is discovered by some other gang members / drug dealers who slash his tires and try to shoot him down. While some may argue Moss was doomed from the very first step he took, as later we find out there's a tracker in the briefcase anyways, this is still a symbolic turning point. To put it quite simply, everything goes to hell for our protagonist after his attempt of having a moral conscience. More interesting is the contrast between Sheriff Bell and Anton Chigurh. The man we were first introduced to in the very few beginning shots was Sheriff Bell, as one would assume, and he represents the voice of reason in the town, and his job as a sheriff is to maintain the order. Yet, as the film progresses, it is obvious that Bell is unable to accept the current state of society. He feels lost, and even more so as he comes to terms with the fact that he may have been deluded all along after a crucial scene where he visits his uncle Ellis, telling him that he plans to quit his position soon, feeling tired and discouraged by the recent events. Ellis responds that the world around him was always crazy and inexplicable, and implies that Bell was simply too naive to understand that his whole life. As much as Bell represents the past, then Anton Chigurh represents the chaotic, undefinable future, or perhaps a reality that has always been that people like Bell are terrified of. Besides looking insanely creepy with that mushroom dew, Chigurh is unhinged and devoid of a classic motive like most villains do. If he does have a classic motive, it's never identified. Instead, we can only understand that he opposed the principle of inevitability, a predetermined fate indeed, most recognizable by his infamous coin flip method of determining if the person in front of him will be shot dead or get to live another day. The reason why Chigurh makes a great villain, and an especially tormenting one to Bell, is because of his near godlike exactment of justice. It's unpredictable and goes beyond law or reason. How do you fix someone or somewhere that thinks like that? You simply can't. Interestingly enough, the Coen brothers shot most of No Country for Old Men's latter half, outside of the traditional Western setting. A Texan border town with gas stations, streets lined with shops near an active highway. Like any Western, there's still that beige, stripped-down quality to each scene, but we're nonetheless brought into a civilization littered with lights and populated with people, where Moss still remains in as much danger as he was back home. He is forced to stay in these seedy motels, and he hides his money in air ducts found in his room. Essentially, he's blissfully unaware for much of the film, before he finds out about the tracker that is, how close he is to being killed off at any instant. However, the visuals never let us as the audience feel that way, because there's a certain sort of anxiety that washes over you whichever point you are at in the film, one that never lets you feel totally safe. The type that's always lurking somewhere in the background, almost blending into its surroundings until it shoots right at you. Much of this tension is portrayed through noir imagery, deserted alleyways, low-key natural lighting, and carefully sequenced back and forth shots depicting just how close Chigurh really was to blowing the brains out of Moss. Which, again, if you have watched the film, spoiler alert, he does, eventually. Speaking of Moss getting his brains blown out, the plot structure of No Country for Old Men is probably its most enigmatic quality. We are left with less closure than we would normally expect for a story with a relatively simple plotline. For much of the film, we follow Moss, Bell, and Chigurh as they go about their day, all intertwined in the same story. They sit at diners, they buy socks, they enter and exit buildings, all while trying to get closer to one another for their different motivations. Yet some of the most important scenes are shot off camera. The most prime example may be when Moss is killed by Chigurh. We never get to see that scene, really, only a brief glimpse of his bloody dead body from the perspective of a distraught Bell. We also never fully get to know what happens to Carla Jean, Moss's wife, who chooses to reject Chigurh's style of fate and refuses to pick heads or tails. We may assume she's dead, but that's still up to audience interpretation, not certainty. Chigurh ends up getting pretty banged up in a car crash towards the end, but he still evades justice despite his brutal injuries. If there's one character we get a sense of closure from, it's Bell, who has since retired just like he said he would, and he closes off the film by recounting the dreams he had the night before to his wife. and then the film cuts to black. That's it. And many viewers felt unsatisfied with this. They wanted to feel a sense of completion or perhaps retribution, but the Coen brothers, not really out of character, refused to offer that. Watch A Serious Man or even Fargo. More often than not, there's this absurd nature to the plot that just doesn't seem to make sense. Protagonists living relatively mundane and respectable lives suffer against the perils of fate. The future of the Western may seem uncertain and even a lost cause. No longer do we find the black and white morality applicable to current educated perspectives on American history. Filmmakers like the Coen brothers had to find new ways to tell the story of the American frontier and its relationship to the rest of the ever-changing nation. No Country for Old Men was certainly a successful example of such an attempt. I mean, it won Best Picture at the Oscars. So, maybe the Western hadn't died, but is rather undergoing a reincarnation, adjusting to the realities of the present while maintaining the rugged bravado, no matter how imagined, of the past. This is Breakfast at Mulholland, and thank you for watching. Okay, now subscribe.